Good morning. My name is Andrew Lang, and I'm an associate professor of history at Mississippi State University. It's my great pleasure to join History Summit 2021 to discuss my newly released book, A Contest of Civilizations, Exposing the Crisis of American Exceptionalism in the Civil War Era, published in 2021 by the University of North Carolina Press. A Contest Civilizations appears as the final volume in UNC Press's Littlefield History of the Civil War Era. The book I intended to be a synthetic narrative history of mid-19th century US history and the Civil War era in particular. But in many ways, it's an introspection into the nature and paradoxes of the American character, the American Union, and America's great sectional crisis. The book uses the controversial concept of American exceptionalism to narrate the coming, the conduct, and the long-term consequences of the United States Civil War. American exceptionalism, of course, is a centerpiece, a long-contested, controversial centerpiece of the American character. And I try to make the point that myriad Americans of diverse persuasions subscribed to notions of the United States' seeming unique place in the 19th century world. But what might that mean? I'll be defining the concept a little bit later on, but I think that it's important to understand the concept the way contemporaries would have understood and applied the concept. Here's Daniel Webster in 1832, at the 100th birthday of George Washington. Here's what he said about what we might term American exceptionalism. Webster was talking about celebrating, really, commemorating the establishment of constitutional self-government, for which he said, "Such a thing has happened only once in human affairs, and but once. The event stands out as a prominent exception to all ordinary history." The same sentiment was articulated much earlier by Alexander Hamilton in Federalist I. At the very beginning of the essay, Hamilton wrote this: "It has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country, by their conduct and example, to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection or choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force." Now, as Hamilton and Webster suggested, what made the United States seemingly unique was that which Abraham Lincoln identified as the signal marker of the American character. For Lincoln, and for so many other white Americans, the idea, the ideal, the notion of self-government, it was hardly inevitable. Rather, for Lincoln, it was a proposal that human society could govern itself absent a divine right monarchy, an entrenched oligarchy, a suffocating aristocracy. In 1838, at the Young Men's Lyceum in Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln said this about the founding of the United States, that it was a proposition which had hitherto been considered at best no better than problematical, namely, the capability of a people to govern themselves. For Lincoln, for Webster, for Hamilton, self-government was fragile because in their minds, it had never worked anywhere else in the world. Now, for 19th century Americans, self-government had a particular meaning, and it was drawn based on what it was not. It was not monarchy. It was not aristocracy. It was not oligarchy. This is what Alexis de Tocqueville observed on his grand tour in the early 1830s. Tocqueville said that Americans would tolerate pretty much anything, but they would not tolerate aristocracy. They would not tolerate an imagined sense of hierarchy. They had, as Tocqueville said, an obsession with the equality of conditions. Equality of conditions. This was largely the point of the first sentence of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. in November 1863, when he said most famously, "407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." Equality of conditions. That was the end goal, the end purpose of self-government. This unique charge for a human society to employ self-government, democracy, for the end of conditional equality. Now, equality, of course, had a very specific meaning for Lincoln. It had a very specific and narrow meaning for white 19th century Americans. Here's what Lincoln said in February of 1861 on his way to Washington shortly before his inauguration. Here's what he said about equality. "It was not the mere matter of the separation of the colonies from the motherland, but that sentiment in the Declaration of Independence which gave liberty, not alone to the people of this country, but I hope to the world for all future time. It was that which gave promise that in due time the weight would be lifted from the shoulders of all men." This is the essence of American exceptionalism, as so many white 19th century Americans would have understood the concept. And thus the book, A Contest of Civilization, traces the cross purposes to which Americans placed these ideals of self-government, democracy, liberty, equality, union, all throughout the 19th century. And it was these cross purposes which fueled the sectional crisis, informed secession, patterned the creation of the Confederate States of America, and ultimately legitimated the cause of union and emancipation. The book attempts to trace how a diverse cast of 19th century Americans regarded the United States as the pinnacle nation, as they defined it, within the modern world. But the great tension, the great problem, was that of the commanding place of slavery within a republic of liberty, within a republic of self-government. Slavery imposed contested and ultimately irreconcilable understandings of American exceptionalism. Those irreconcilable understandings, of course, contributing to the coming conduct and consequences of the Civil War. A conflict that tested, as Lincoln said, whether the United States would indeed remain the last best hope of Earth. Now, a caveat. To be sure, I concede that the concept of American exceptionalism may seem problematic to some modern audiences. And I do not attempt in this book, I do not attempt to validate or to prove exceptionalist arguments. Instead, I maintain that it's important to take seriously how and why Americans of a previous era considered their nation, its founding, its constitution, its democracy, as the ostensible zenith of modern political enterprises. Only then, I maintain, can we fully grasp the complexity for which Americans waged a bloody civil war over the very existence, meaning, and fate of the self-proclaimed exceptional republic. Now, it should be obvious up to this point that the book can be and probably should be read as a meditation on the turbulent events that we face today as a national people. Again, while I make no claim about the veracity of exceptionalist thought, generations of Americans have imagined the United States as a unique republic that balances individual liberty and conceives new births of freedom. But therein, the book reveals in painful ways that the American experience has never been so idyllic. Implementing the national mission, implementing the national ideals have often been riddled with paradox, contradiction, shortcoming. And yet the book also reminds us that the enduring ideals of equality and liberty, properly understood, properly applied, establish standards for all Americans to strive for a more perfect union. This book, I hope this book reminds us that the United States does not, did not, never has enjoyed an inevitable destiny, a destiny immune from the course of history. The nation's survival depends on an active commitment to true equality. It depends on a citizenry committed to enduring principles of American life, lest those principles fade from our own malevolence or neglect. Now, as I alluded to a moment ago, the book reveals that the great tension, the great paradox, the great tragedy of 19th century American exceptionalism was that the ideal of self-government was used often to limit and restrict access to the ideal of equality and liberty. That's the great paradox. There existed among the diverse national population competing, hostile, and irreconcilable notions of exceptionalist thought in this regard. Of course, anti-slavery coalitions worked to decenter and in some cases abolish slavery in the United States, or at least some regions of the United States, of course, during the early Republic period. But powerful slaveholders used the constitutional mechanisms of self-government, democracy, and the power of racial mastery to turn the United States into the world's uncontested and largest slaveholding nation. The ubiquity of human bondage, the book demonstrates, in an ostensible land of liberty and a land of self-government fueled powerful critiques and resistance among the United States' large African-American population, a population who'd been excised from formal politics and social inclusion. There were few groups in the United States who condemned the shortcoming, the contradiction, and the flaw of American exceptionalism to argue, how can a nation claim to be a self-governing society for the ends of equality and liberty, and yet so explicitly deny access to that liberty, and in some cases erase it altogether from large swaths of the national population? This was the charge leveled routinely by the great African-American abolitionist Frederick Douglass. In his famous What to the Slave is the 4th of July, Douglass, in ingenious ways, turned exceptionalist rhetoric on its head, exposed its hypocrisy, and leveled his critiques at white Northerners to say that it is you who have failed the national charge. Douglass used exceptionalist rhetoric in expert ways to show its shortcoming. In that speech, I'll read you just one short passage. He said, and now keep in mind, this is on purpose. This is exceptionalism to a T. Douglass said, "Go where you may, search where you will, roam through all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world, travel through South America, search out every abuse, and when you have found the last, lay your facts by the side of everyday practices of this nation. And you will say with me that for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival. Reigns without a rival. It is the exception. It is unique because of the sins it is committing, tolerating, sanctioning." Charlotte Forten, a free woman of color, a Northern abolitionist, similarly said, "There is not a single spot in this broad land where our rights can be protected. It's strange," she said, "that white Americans cannot feel their own degradation, the weight of the chains which they have imposed upon themselves." When the anti-slavery Republican coalition elected Abraham Lincoln to the presidency in 1860, slaveholders severed the Union to protect what they considered to be their sacrosanct institution of slavery. The institution, they argued, that was the essence of civilization, the cornerstone of American exceptionalism, the guarantor of liberty, the guarantor of white equality, the basis of self-government. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, in his infamous Cornerstone address, used exceptionalism, used exceptionalist rhetoric to justify and explain the entire purpose of Confederate nationhood. Here, Stevens rejected American exceptionalism as it was once understood. He rejected the Declaration of Independence. He rejected the Constitution as a charter of human liberty. He said the Confederate States of America was based in opposition to these ideals. And thus the Confederacy was unique in the world. It was the exception to the world. It was the exception to the United States. Quote, "This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon the great physical, philosophical, and moral truth that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is the natural and normal condition," end quote, for people of color. Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address conversely explored how the American Civil War was waged as a contest over the meaning of the United States' place in the world. The war tested, he said, whether a republic conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition of equality could long endure. Here, Lincoln implied there was nothing inevitable about the endurance of the United States and its ideals. The war was a proving ground, perhaps a necessary proving ground, on which common citizens, the cogs of self-government, battled to safeguard the delicate privilege of self-government in the service to a new birth of freedom. This is why, well, I should back up. The Union's war against the Confederacy embodied 19th century struggles against liberty and despotism, democracy and aristocracy, progress and reaction, republicanism and monarchism. For Lincoln and thousands of white loyal citizens, if slaveholding secessionists succeeded in severing an egalitarian republic in the name of slavery and human bondage, they would signal that the founders' work was not self-evident, that the rights they established in the Declaration and Constitution were not universal, that there could exist an alternate American nation, one rooted in oppression, slavery, and hierarchy. This is why emancipation figured so prominently in a war for union. Emancipation aided in the preservation of self-government. It liberated the United States from its aristocratical, hierarchical, and oligarchical trappings of slaveholding. But for African Americans, emancipation was the gateway toward liberating the U.S. from its fallacious sins and reconciling the U.S. with its better angels. Few Americans had a greater stake in the outcome of the war. Few Americans better understood the implications of a war as a contest for true human liberation and true equality. A soldier in the 107th United States Colored Troops said this: "This war is the great battle for the benefit, not only of the country, but for ourselves and the whole of mankind. The eyes of the world are upon us. I recognize in the stability of this government a stability marked by the guarantee of universal equality, which will serve as a source of strength to other nations." Now, my story does not end here. The final third of the book addresses and explores the era of Reconstruction as a referendum on the contested meanings of the Civil War, Union, and American exceptionalism. It is here that the implications of the American founding, the war, and the entire 19th century itself reverberate to the present day. Would an emancipated republic, constitutionally rehabilitated in the image of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, stand, truly stand, as Abraham Lincoln's last best hope? Or, as Frederick Douglass asked in 1880 in the wake of Reconstruction, had the cause of freedom and humanity ever been the true cause of union itself? I will leave you, future readers, to understand and to grasp how this story ends. For Reconstruction is a story about who we have been and who we are. I hope you enjoy the book, and I look forward to discussion. Thank you.